So, hi, Hellenique. Thank you for joining us again on Finding Startups podcast. We have, in previous episodes, we've spoken about the importance of personality. We've spoken about the value of having unique qualities and what that brings to the business table in general. Today, we'll discuss the 9 common leadership styles, and I'd like to, at some point, specifically touch on how that affects startups in particular, and perhaps even makes or breaks their success. But before we get into that, perhaps we can jump right into the 9 different styles and the different theories that you know so well about, and then take it from there. So perhaps I'll leave it to you.
Samantha, for inviting me again. Always nice to talk with you about these subjects because, as we see, innovation entrepreneurship is quite an important area of development for us as a species, but also as individuals. We all have the opportunity nowadays to individualize business in a way that we really didn't have before. We had companies and you had to fit into the company culture, whereas now you can design a kind of culture for your business, and you absolutely have to. In order to be a successful startup, you need a team, you need a certain kind of mindset of how things are going to be approached. You need to know that you're all on the same page, that you've got a vision, and that you're working hard for that. And today we're going to go into really the distinction of each team player. And there's so many different ways to find the right people for your team. And then there's so many different ways where you struggle to do that, because you really need to find people that have, the motivation and that share your vision to start off with, but also a very specific skill set that is going to complement the business. And this is, roulette, really. You're playing a game of risk and chance. And some people do it in a less risky way, where they actually interview people, they put them through grueling tests, they might actually get to know them for a year or two before they include them in their team. They might collaborate, network, and really test the people out. Other people might just go with someone that's a friend. But really, when we're looking at, finding the right people to work with and building the right alliances, it's a process, it's a journey, just as much as it is for us to figure out who we are and what role we play. Because you might think you're the originator of the business, you have the vision, and so you should be the director, for example.
Yeah.
But do you have the leadership quality for that? And do you actually know how to lead people? Do you know how to manage? Do you know the difference between managing people and leading people? Maybe you are really good at managing projects, but you're not very good with people. So that would put you a little bit in a disadvantaged position, because you would probably always be wanting, with good intention, to make things run well, but you're not reaching people in a way where they feel warm, they feel inspired, they feel connected to you. They might find you quite cold. This happens often when people have very specific technical skill and they don't necessarily have the PR. Person relating kind of quality in their personality. So that's why we go into personality. And I've started a new style of study now, which I call the psychology of business. And it's really, I would say, a little different to what other people are doing, because it's looking more at how psychology understands the process of business and how it complements business nowadays. Because really a lot of success psychology talks about achievement and performance and productivity, and industrial psychology talks about industry and how we organize teams, human resource, etc. My take is slightly more clinical than that, meaning that it's a little bit more traditional psychology that talks about personality structure and how your ego is operating all the time in who you are. And if we know even just a little bit about the movement of awakening and awareness in the world right now, a lot of mindfulness, a lot of mindset kind of words are being thrown around. And really what we're saying is that on a fundamental level, human beings are beginning to realize that there's something a bit more than just who you are out there in the world, the mask you wear, and who you want to be, which we talk about as your ego, right? So you have a part of your personality, which we work on quite deeply as psychologists, and it's a part of the personality that can literally crack up and struggle in life, when it's had a lot of trauma, when it's had violence, when it's had difficulties in childhood, when there's been neglect, the ego doesn't develop very, very strongly. It might be fragile. It might feel very insecure. And so it does a variety of things to cover that up and protect us. And that's what an ego is for. It's like a mask that we wear. So in psychology, certain styles of psychology, they've gone really deep into this subject. And the reason why it's so relevant to business and leadership is because anyone who gets power in a leadership role is bound to use that power in a way that suits their ego. And their ability to be responsible, mature, and effective as a leader has everything to do with how well that person has matured their emotional body. So the way they deal with their emotions, the way they get angry and deal with it, the way they might be disappointed, how do they deal with that? They have very high standards and they think they can shout at people that are being paid by them, for example. How do they deal with that? You know, how do you deal with life challenges and relationships with people? And your ego has found a way to do that based on what you went through when you were a child and based on how your spirit incarnates into your body. Now, it gets a bit too complicated for most people, so I'm going to really simplify it today. And I'm going to mention something around the Enneagram, because this is where my 9 styles of leadership is born from. Yeah. And it's a style of typology, the Enneagram. You know that, Samantha?
I do, yeah. I've heard of it, yeah.
Okay. And what do you know about it? Like, what's your take on it?
Not much. So maybe for the audience, it would be great to...
Yeah, I will cover it again, but it's just interesting that a lot of people have actually heard about it. And it's a very interesting story that came from the 13th century. A mystic, half Armenian, half Greek, called Gurdjieff, actually brought in this information that energy moves in 9 ways. Later on, a Bolivian self-development expert called Oscar Sanchez, at the peak of psychology and psychoanalysis in the 1970s, his work was extended, confirmed, and developed even further. And what Oscar Sanchez started to do was look at how does this principle in physics, you know, like in mathematics, we use the numbers 1 to 9, and in India, they developed the number 0. Maybe nice thing to remember. From 0 to 9, we have like 10 numbers, and we circulate and repeat those through mathematics and physics. That's how our universe is understood by us, is through the way that we use numbers to understand all kinds of formulas and arrangements in the universe. And so Oscar took that principle and he looked at how does this then apply to human behavior? How can we understand human behavior in 9 ways that human behavior moves and develops, and found out that there are ways to actually then develop a typology system and to test that system. And that's what they did a lot in the 70s. My teacher, who's still alive now, amazingly, in his late 80s, was one of the people who started testing a lot of these theories. And they are theories that explain that the ego develops a certain style of protection, certain defense system, and it serves us well in life to tell us that reality is a certain way. We end up believing that. We end up having crazy ideas about how things are and how things exist and how things should be. And we are totally convinced by them. So we end up with a very strong mask that we are wearing all day long. Even when we come home, we have another version. Sometimes our lovers, partners, parents, family, people close to us, the dog, the cat, will find a more truthful part of us. Like when we're angry, we might kick the door or kick the cat or shout at the brother or, you know, slam doors, etc. And we'll show other parts of us that we wouldn't necessarily show at work. But still, even at that time, our ego is still a shield protecting us from a deeper truth of who we really are. And that's how most people live. They live in that ego space. That's why all these spiritual sages, mystics, seers, gurus are talking all the time about, you know, you have to die unto the ego, and the ego has to be worked on, right? And you have to transcend the ego. And a lot of spiritual teachings are telling us that we have to do that and how to do that. And, you meditate this long, or you get on your head, or you go on retreat, or you take this potion, or you stop doing that thing. But really, it's a very complicated story to actually dismantle your ego and drop your pride and get in touch with your vulnerability and live in the world from a place where you are much more truthfully yourself. And you mentioned the great quote before we started. Maybe we can bring that in, because it's a great place to say exactly what this monk is sharing.
Yeah, it's actually a quote from Jay Shetty, who was, I'm sure a lot of people know who he is, but he's now a very big influencer, and he shares his life stories with the world and how it also relates to business, actually, in many respects. But he I think at the age of 22, I believe, he went and he became a monk for 3 years, and he lived his own truth, and he is a big believer in doing everything as close to what it should be as possible. So if you're going to be a monk, you live the monk's life to a T, so that if you're trying to understand somebody else's perspective, then you have to really live in their shoes exactly as they live it. And anyway, he said a quote which was quite interesting, and he said, "You don't know what you need in your life until you figure out who you are." And I think that's quite relevant to business as well.
Yes, and this is where we wanted to go eventually, our conversation, because you might have all kinds of desires for success as a startup that are coming from unmet needs, desires, fears, complexes that you have from childhood. And so you are motivated in a certain way, but then you are also tripping yourself up to fail in a certain way too. Because let's say you just want to be successful so that people will respect you, because you've never felt respect from your mother or father. They've always told you that you're never going to amount to much. Or you've had friends who've succeeded, and everybody looked at you one day when you were 17 and said, well, at least you have a friend who's successful. And you think, oh my God, that means they don't believe in me. And your self-esteem is driving you to be the kind of person that you want to be, so that you will get respect, love, and adoration, validation, etc. So when you're not really conscious of that, and you don't know what these unmet needs, desires, fears really are inside of you, it can be quite a dangerous road for you to become an entrepreneur or a startup, because there's a lot of challenges. There's lots of mentoring you actually need to overcome a lot of these challenges. And if your self-esteem is tied up into every moment where you struggle, you get challenged, or you do the thing that you call failure, then it's a pretty heart-wrenching process.
Yeah.
And that's why knowing what ego style you have is so profound, because it's going to show you at the fundamental level of personality what your ego flavor is like, and what kind of crazy ideas you have, and what is the deeper truth behind them. Now, it's a process again to find all of that out, but there are nowadays these great teachers, as I said, Oscar Sanchez, who started it, and then Dr. Claudio Naranjo, who took it much further. He's from Chile. South Americans are very developed in a certain style of psychology. So Dr. Claudio actually started a movement called the Movement for Human Potential, and he was headhunted up to UCLA in California to teach the Enneagram. He taught it, it spread through America, and people started taking it into business. And so now a man called Hudson has actually developed a test. It's spread like wildfire, and most businesses use the Enneagram now to profile personalities that fit well in a team. I take this and I go one step further with it. I'm actually now talking about the 9 styles of personality and what skill set they provide us with. In other words, what team player role do you have that suits your startup or your company or your team really well? But then also, what brilliance do you have in that? That's one thing the Enneagram already tells us. But then, what is the secret ingredient for you to stop suffering in this neurotic dance that your ego does in all these crazy ideas that you have about life? When you start cultivating a life that is integrating with this secret ingredient. So in other words, every neurotic ego, we said there are 9 of them, actually can be split into another 2 types of each one. So there's 27 different types, 9 times 3, 27. And that means we can have a personality type 1 or 2 or 3 or 4, and then we have either one version of the one, the second or the third version. We call them wings. And each of them give a slightly different take on that one personality. And then that particular style, and I'm going to demonstrate them very soon, can have a crazy idea that defines why it's a 1 type of neurosis. Let's say we call personality a neurosis in this sense. So your personality is not really who you are. It's just who you developed. It's a neurotic defense system to whatever you suffered with in life. So when you get this crazy idea about how you need to be in public, about what you should be doing 9 to 5, about how to deal with your discipline, and all kinds of crazy ideas about all kinds of things. What kind of person is good for you in relationship, all kinds of blind spots that you never consider. When you start to see your blind spots, you become one of the most powerful people in the world, because you're no longer deceiving yourself and you're no longer under the control of your ego. You are now starting to see things in a totally realistic way, and it takes time.
Yeah.
But once you cultivate that, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna come in on that and say, a lot of reason for success is when you have clarity of vision, and to achieve that, you need to have a clear head, obviously, but you also have to step out of the trap that is perception. And as you just mentioned, perception comes from all sides, be it family, be it friends, be it basically the society that imposes that sort of perception onto you, so that suddenly you start believing what people perceive you to be. And that is, that is a big trap, because until you can start to clear your way through the fog of that perception, you won't have that clarity of vision to take things forward.
Yeah, and I think when you speak about clarity of vision, I'm also thinking about someone I interviewed this morning who said confidence is an inside game, an inside job. That if you spend a lot of time worrying about what other people think about you or say about you, you can't actually develop that inner confidence, because you have to do it for you. You have to decide what value you have. You have to know that you can motivate yourself, inspire yourself. You have to work with yourself and how you feel. So everybody else's opinion actually is a waste of time, because it's just a distraction of you now trying to see if they see value in you. But if you don't see it in you, it's impossible to implement your vision. Yeah. So even if you know, and clearly, you see how you are in the world, and you see even your blind spots, the question is now, are you going to do the work to get in touch with who you really are? Yeah. And then when you do, each type of these that I mentioned, each one of the 9 types, so knowing that we have the distinctions of the 27, each type does this in a different way and has a different secret ingredient that they need to learn to integrate in order to stop the suffering, stop the self-deception, and stop the crazy ideas. And it takes a while to implement that, because you have to change the way you look at reality and the way you're looking at yourself. And once you start that process, here's the great, fantastic news of why we put this on the agenda of things to talk about. You start developing a type of leadership potential and power that is totally unique to you, that no one else can ever compete or compare you with, and that is so genuine and so heartfelt and so real that it has power in and of its own force, because it is a unique force in nature, just like you are. So every single person has this opportunity, and every person has a chance to actually develop this kind of insight. And it's in fact not even that they have the opportunity, it's also imperative that they do. Because if they don't, they just suffer more and more. And there are many examples of people that have continued to pursue certain things and not really feel fulfilled by them. That's an example of what it's like when we don't do the work. And a lot of people end up in older ages, let's say, with a very great sense of fulfillment. And that's because they've taken this growth curve in life and they've figured out that it's not all about what their ego wants. It's not all about what the ego is telling us. That the ego is sort of a protective defense mechanism, and at a certain point you have to grow out of it. So the 9 styles of leadership then is around the explanation of what it is that you've now learned from your type of personality. All the challenges and consequences of those have given you opportunities to figure out a little bit more truth about who you are. It's very uncomfortable because the ego doesn't like to see the vulnerability ever. So whenever you're challenged, you're vulnerable. And so when you're vulnerable, you go deeper, you see the truth. And then from there, you start seeing, hey, wow, all these years I've been believing that it's about this, so I developed this skill. But now I'm in touch with this deeper truth of who I am, and now I can develop this truth. And you start actually seeing your own power in a really genuine, authentic way, and you develop it, and it gets stronger, and it becomes a power that can help lead your life and everyone else around you in whatever position you take. So it's a slightly different approach to leadership.
No, definitely. And it's it integrates quite nicely because it's not just about leadership or your leadership style or your personality style. You develop an understanding of what you're good at, what you're not good at, and being able to accept that and transcend, as you were suggesting, the ego is one of the biggest challenges in any startups, really, is because once you start your own business or once you start becoming an entrepreneur or solopreneur even, you have to start understanding what it is that you are good at, what you're not so good at, and where you can perhaps start delegating or outsourcing responsibilities within the company. And so just to bring it back a little bit to startups, most startups that start out have small teams, either the co-founders, there's 2 or 3 of them, and obviously they tend to wear different hats before they have the money to recruit and grow their team. So with each role comes different leadership styles and different personalities. How difficult do you think is it for a person to adapt to different styles when it's not intrinsic to their personality?
Exactly the same answer as I would give on many questions in this area, is that it depends on their enneatype, it depends on their insight level and their commitment and willingness to become emotionally mature. Because some personalities have a certain flavor of adaptability. They're flexible, they're agile. Some personalities are much more rigid. So that in itself defines how willing am I to adopt to a certain leadership style. For example, there's a long way to go from where I'm explaining 9 types of personality into 9 types of neurosis, into then 9 types of leadership, that explains, okay, well then how do I, as a 1, adapt to an authoritative boss?
Exactly.
Right? A long way to go to explain even that is such an individualistic reaction response to an authority figure, depending on what kind of trauma, wounding, childhood, personality, neurosis, ego you've developed because of all that stuff. So what we see, for example, is a 1, which is a great example, is someone that takes up the position of having a lot of authority. And that's a really good example then of someone who can struggle a lot to have authoritative parents, and or experiences the authority of the parent in quite a negative way sometimes, and might even have had very violent parenting. So there's a wound there in childhood that makes them have to take up this position of being really in control all the time, and they become the moral perfectionist. And so it's very easy for them to go into a room and criticize the room. When others are listening to it, it sounds like criticism. To them, they are really trying to fix the room to make sure that it's operating at the level that they think it needs to be operating. So they might come into a conference room and say, well, well, why did they put the light in the corner over there? You're supposed to have the light in the middle of the conference room so that everybody's face can be lit up. This is totally wrong. I don't think I can use this room. They'll go back to the secretary and say, I need a room that's actually much more considerate of how everyone's going to be, like interacting and collaborating. They might be that specific about things. They'll give you their opinion very easily. So someone like that, for example, you won't know at the time because not everyone has these tools of psychology to investigate. Let's do the test. Or you could say, I have a team of people and I want to see, generally, do we fit together? And we could do that profiling for sure. But in a general sense, you can get a feeling sometimes of people, but you have a certain culture in a business or in a startup that is sort of dictated, let's say, by the visionary, that the startup person. And then, quite frankly, from what I see, it's kind of ad hoc, it sort of just happens. And then we now are studying, how does success just happen? So now we know, okay, well, there's certain formulas, there's strategies to making it work. And yes, it does sometimes take a deeper look at who are these individuals, not just what hard skill do they have, but what personality are they carrying, because that's telling us what kind of ego style do they have, and then what kind of leadership ability potential can they develop if they do the inner work. Because it's now not just about, I go and learn how to lead and I say I'm a facilitative leader and I learn how to listen to people and I learn how to integrate what they say or be interactive. I mean, quite frankly, we need way more than that in the world right now to succeed and to actually make great impact. We need people who are very awake, very aware, very responsible, people who are emotionally mature. We don't just need people who go and learn a few techniques and strategies on how to lead a group. We need true wisdom in our leaders. And so each one of us has to cultivate that.
Yeah, it's interesting that you should bring that up, because actually I've spoken to quite a few venture capitalists and investors, and when I ask them generally what is it in a startup that you specifically look for when you want to invest, what's the biggest number one thing, and 100% or 95% of them will tell you, I look at the individuals running the company, I look at the people behind the idea, I look at their personality, and I see within the space of maybe 5 or 10 minutes of speaking to them if they can take their vision to where I need the vision to be taken. And so it's very interesting to see that investors actually look at personality and the people behind the company before they look at the idea and the concept and how scalable it is.
Absolutely. And I'm so glad that you confirm this, because I asked some Estonian incubators, trainers, the same question. And then I asked a few successful leaders. And then I also asked my mentor, my business coach's partner, who's a marketing expert. And I got the same answer. I was really concerned about my own struggle as an entrepreneur, getting a lot of advice and coaching from people that really didn't take me very far, to be honest. And I realized that it was because my personality was really buying into the silver lining too much. And they were also selling the silver lining too much. They weren't really selling the nitty-gritty business building blocks. And I vowed from those experiences that I would be a different voice in this community and in the training circles to talk about the challenges of business and the reality of stamina. So I asked these people, what is the one thing that you think makes the difference between those who succeed or those who don't? Because I've been in so many business circles, I was telling them, and I've gone to a lot of training, and I'm a very bright, knowledgeable woman. And what I can see is that it's all about marketing, but it's also a certain kind of quality within. Sorry that my phone keeps beeping. I'm trying to use my mobile to tell us about the 9 styles, and I've got someone who keeps sending me messages here, and it's getting a little annoying. So I'm glad to say that they're over. I hope they won't get any more, because they were asking me some questions. I was trying to get rid of them, but then I see they're still on the phone. So they said stamina. They said the business idea, the investors, the incubators, the trainers, they can work with stuff. But what they can't work with is someone who doesn't really have the personality strength, we call that ego strength, although it's now, because we've become even more distinctive in our talking about the ego, it might be too much of a generalization, but the strength of the person, not the personality or the ego, because we've gone deeper into say those are distinctions, is really what makes the difference. But in psychology, we do call that ego strength. Your ego has to be quite strong in order for you to remold it, you know, because sometimes business does that. In fact, that's the point of business. That's why a lot of us want to go through this process. It's going to transform us. So when you looking at now the different types, you've got someone who's very moral and perfectionistic. You've got someone who's very mothering, caring, compassionate. Then you've got someone who's very driven to achieve. Then you've got someone who's very romantic and idealistic. You can see my numbers coming up here. Then you've got someone who's the investigative thinker. They're the scientist types. Then you've got someone who's normal, the loyal guardian. They can be quite fearful of life. And then you've got someone who's always the optimistic entertainer. That's the kind I am, number 7. Then you've got someone who's like the protective challenger. And this is someone like Trump, who is a kind of rebel archetype, a Fidel Castro type archetype. And they are very oppositional, very challenging. They wake people up by being oppositional. But they are protective challengers. And that is their leadership skill, actually. Because in being that way, they're quite fiery, they're quite in the body, they're quite action-based, they're not really thinking a lot, they're not very emotive, they're more action-orientated, because we get 3 types of movement in the Enneagram. We get emotion, thought, and action. And our job for each one of us is to integrate all 3. So we can't just say, oh, well, I'm a thinking type and that's good for me. Well, no, we have to become balanced individuals. So we have to learn to take our thinking into action. And then we need to know how we feel about that. And what do we feel that's driving our thoughts? Sometimes we need to deal with the feeling as it is and not just be in the head all the time. Sometimes we just have to get things done. So we all need all 3 of these things. But going back to the 8, Fidel Castro, Trump types, they are leaders that are protective and challenging in their style. Now, here's a great example of how it integrates. If I don't know that about myself, that I actually am an 8, and I have a tendency to be quite fiery and quite judgmental and quite power-driven, as an 8 does, I can lead people astray. And that's the power of an 8, and that's the neurosis of an 8. And we hope that they won't, and often they don't. But, I mean, often they don't seem to. But if you look at these two examples of leadership, I'm giving you now 2 great men who have done great things, and they've also done it in quite a volatile, authoritative, kind of fiery, almost dangerous way. So then one questions, how much insight do they really have? Because if you get the insight, and here's the magical shift from the Enneagram now into the 9 styles of leadership, that kind of leader can become extraordinarily powerful in his own right. Trump could be extraordinarily powerful if he learned to contain his neurotic edge, which is the part that gets a little bit insulting, the part that gets lustful. It's so interesting to me. I saw this recently, that one way of defining the 8 is that their emotional impurity. We talk about impurities of the mind in Buddhism, and in psychology we also talk about emotions that are sometimes toxic. Each one of these 9 types has a certain emotional state, and the 8, the emotional state is lust. So it's kind of like a craving for that kind of juicy, sexual, wanting kind of vibe, and you get that.
Yeah. It's like the shiny
And
new syndrome.
Again?
It's like the shiny new thing syndrome.
Right. And you might get a little bit of that even more classic form in a 3, because the 3s are very much achievement based. So they are always looking for the new thing. 7s also have shiny new thing syndrome in a different way too, because they're always chasing, like me, experiences. They have a really strong fear I don't want to jump around too much here, but I'm just going to say this about the 7, and then I'll move to the 9 and come back to what is the prize when we learn about our neurosis for each type. So I get really excited about this work. I can talk about it forever because I went deep 4 years into it, but I did it first as a healing for my own self after divorce. I needed to understand why my personality conflicted so much with my partner. And I find out that my partner was a certain type. I found out my type. I saw the clashes. And now imagine you go into a startup with somebody and you don't know any of this about yourself. Neither do they. And not a lot of people do, you know. Yeah. But you could be something like the 7 that I just said that likes the shiny objects, very much driven to experiences. 7 has a real fear sometimes of missing out. FOMO is big for 7s. It's a simplification as well because it's way more complicated in each individual. But let's simplify it down and say that fear of missing out, right? And 7s then, because of that, they have the emotional passion of greed. They want so many experiences. I mean, I've worked in 13 countries. I've traveled the world. I'm only 45. I've done a lot of things. I'm a great example of a 7. 7 has to realize, for example, that doing that, I have the skill of being very optimistic, and I have the skill of being able to spin a situation and see the silver lining, and that's what makes me a great therapist and a great trainer. Sometimes I can miss the deeper, dirty, difficult, emotional mud. But because I'm a social 7, remember I said there's 3 types. So the 3rd type of a 7 is someone who's more social. And that is someone who's the counter type of the greed. So I actually hide the greed. So I'm vegetarian. I don't expect people to get all this. So I'm not going to do too much talking about it. But to make the point about business, if I keep missing the deeper truth, which I don't necessarily do as a social type 7, but the other type 7s do, because I get deep down and dirty into the emotions. But a classic 7 that's not a counter type does struggle with this. Then I might not be hearing my team player complain about something that's really important to them. And I might bypass it and just say, oh, don't worry, we're just going to fix that. In our next campaign, we're going to do it like this. As a 7, if I'm leading that group, that person's eventually going to get so pissed off with me. They're going to be like, I don't really want to talk to Helenique anymore about my feedback evaluation of processes, because all she does is just sell me some wonderful, shiny new object. And that becomes my neurotic flavor in the world that people get annoyed with and people back talk me about, which we all know happens in life. And I'm explaining it to you now as a psychologist. This is what we go through in relationships. And so the Enneatype work is so powerful, and the 9 styles of leadership even more so for people in business, because it's a tool that helps you understand what your personality type is doing, what the neurotic edge, your crazy ideas, your ego, your defense system, your mask that you're wearing forces you, convinces you, seduces you actually into becoming and doing in your life, so that you avoid your vulnerability and the deeper truth of who you are. When you see that, you start to get in touch with your vulnerability, you start to admit, you start to get much more real, you start to be more relatable to people, and you start to then cultivate a mix between the skills you got by being in that ego neurotic state, and now the skills of getting real with it. So you integrate with your real self, and you have a really kick-ass, excuse the expression, but hey, why not, version of leadership. Because if I am a 7 that now realizes that, I can start the meeting by saying, you know what, everybody, I don't like doing these kind of meetings, but let's talk about what's going wrong. And I hold back on the need to be the problem solver, silver lining version. And I hear the grievances, I hear the complaints, I don't fix them immediately. I go away because I've learned through my style of leadership to bring a much more thought out example. I go deeper into the realization of actually things are not going so well in these areas. And then I take it back to the group and I say, right, let's do a brainstorm. And I supervise, I facilitate that, I lead that process, because I have that leadership ability to hold that struggle and tension, but I have to work to get to that place. My normal tendency is to want to throw that away, ignore it, and avoid it totally if I'm a classic 7.
Yeah.
Right? And that's such a powerful thing to learn to do as a unique style of leadership that only I can do through my neurotic disposition and through my challenges in life. I have cultivated the ability to be able to bring that style of leadership to the table, unlike any other type.
Yeah.
And then even as a 9, even as a 7, I can do that in a totally unique and individualized way because I am my own type of 7.
Yeah.
Quick finishing on the 9, and then let's chat about it. The 9 is the peacemaker mediator. Example is, that's what I wanted to give you a quick example of each one as well. I just remembered Gandhi is number 1, and the 9 is people like Gerald Ford, Kevin Costner, Whoopi Goldberg is the example I often give, and Janet Jackson. You can see Whoopi Goldberg, she's a bit background. Janet Jackson, a bit background. 9s often, their neurosis is that they forget about how important they are. And they have a real passion for action. They do stuff a lot, but they don't necessarily integrate themselves into the group a lot. So they can be quite annoying in that they're so helpful and so wonderful to have around, but they also like a little bit detached in a way, and you can't reach them so much. It's very similar to a 5, which is the Einstein type. So Einstein is an example of a 5. Gandhi is the example of a 1. Mother Teresa, example of number 2. Oprah, an example of number 3. 3s are very interesting. Most high achievers are 3s, like success-driven people, got to get the new BMW, got to measure up. Until they become conscious, Oprah is a very good example of someone who became conscious as a 3. Developed her ability to see through her neurosis, and then look what she did.
Yeah.
She became extraordinary, outstanding leader, unlike anyone else, right? Why? She's so tapped in, tuned in, turned on by who she is, what she's brilliant at. She's learned from the challenges. She worked her whole career through to get more and more awareness, more and more insight, go past her ego neurotic barrier, more and more and more and more. But she still has the nature of the Enneatype 3, which is like very successful achiever. She's achieved so much. That's the drive of a 3, is to achieve. But if you do it without that consciousness, it's just about the stuff, just about the shiny objects.
But her purpose is different now, I think. Her purpose is to share that knowledge with other people.
Exactly. Yeah. So she realized that along the way of success, I'm also going to educate.
Exactly.
Prince is a number 4, the singer, Prince. Number 5, as I told you, Einstein. 6, example, I forget, let me tell you. And 7, as I told you, I'm an example, but let me give you a more famous person example because it will make it much clearer. Is your 6s are the ones that are the loyal guardians, we said, and the 7s are the ones who are the performers and the positive ones, the silver lining types. So Princess Diana, a very good example of a number 6. They have that reservation as well, that fear. It's always looking out of a window, like a bit skeptical. And 6s can become great lawyers and want to take care of people because they're loyal guardians. They can be very strong, fierce people, but they have a kind of passion.
Awareness. I think I would call it an awareness. Yeah, a general awareness. So they,
to call it an awareness, because it is like they're not so seduced by the innocence of life. They had some stuff happen to them when they were young where they're actually now distrustful a little bit. And the thing that they need to learn is courage, And when they do, they become these extraordinary leaders. And an example of a 7 is Robin Williams. And you can see the real struggle of a 7 through how his life turned out. Like really powerful, able to entertain, able to bring on this positive side, highly talented, very creative, 7s are. But really hard for them to sit in the heaviness, to sit in the difficult emotions of life. And I mean, he, took himself out because it was so hard. So these are the 9 types, and we can see now the struggle. I told you a little bit about the passion, which is the emotion, like the lust, the greed. I won't go through all of them, but it's quite exhausting to process all this information in a short time. So every type has a certain emotion, a distorted preoccupation, let's say. And then the point is to integrate or learn to bring in the actual opposite of that, so that I can become more integrated, more whole, and more complete, and less neurotic. And once I do that, I become an extraordinary leader. So just because we went into Trump, the 8, for example, to just explain that, give an example, has to learn the innocence of being. So that fierce, lustful, you can imagine immediately, if Trump started tapping into his innocence, and he could speak authentically from that place, integrate that as a leader, he would be a lot less dangerous. And because we went into the 9, that's what I said, the 9 has to integrate the action, and the 7, as an example, Robin Williams and me, I gave my example, although I have a lot of 4 as well. They have to learn to live in the simplicity of things, which is very hard for a 7. So to simplify life and to also have sobriety, because 7s can be outrageously experimental and experiential. So they want all these experiences and they can get so overwhelmed. So imagine now you're in a startup with someone who's a 7, as I gave the example in a business meeting. But a lot of creative thinkers are startup people. That doesn't always make for a very good business, let me tell you. Because 7s, very creative types, any of these types can be creative, right? I don't want to simplify things down into categories here, because the Enneagram is one of the most expansive systems that exist in the universe. It's like astronomy. It's like galaxies are revealed through your layers of understanding as you proceed in life through the Enneagram work. And you get revelations of how wide the world is, how big the world is, not how constrained and limited your ego made it. But huge things are possible. So when a startup phase business is happening and you meet the person who's the idea behind it, you got to be a little bit careful, because that idea-based person may not have the personality of implementation, of getting real about stuff, of doing the numbers. So I use another system as well, which is called the Genius Test. And it's a much simplified version, but it's really helpful, where you find out which of the 4 types you might be.
Right.
You might be a creative type, which means you're quite visionary. You might be a people person type, which means you're into PR and building relationships, networking. Or you might be the admin type, that's actually quite focused on organization, office work, likes to be in the background a little bit. Or you might be the person who's really good with time, planning, layout, budgeting, and knows the right time to launch, the right time to put the message out in the market. Now, I think all businesses should have these 4 types, at least. But then, if you can go deeper, and if you yourself are interested in entrepreneurship, not you, but people watching, because I know you are, it's a really good idea to go deep enough to figure out what are your blind spots. Because if you can bring those to the table and you can be real about that, you are a real asset to the team, because then you're not going to be someone who blindly trips and falls or constantly focuses on just being appreciated and validated by everybody around you, and not actually doing the nitty gritty of what needs to be done for a business to grow and build.
No, definitely. And I think a lot of it has to do, especially when we go back to the idea of founders and founders' personality. I think people have to be really open to new experiences, be open to criticism, be open to feedback, and also have the adaptability factor in their nature. Because if they're not flexible enough to hear what other people have to say, or they can't see it for themselves, it's very difficult to be able to adapt. And you don't want to be in a situation where your startup fails or doesn't even get off the ground because you're not open-minded enough to to see where you can improve and develop your personality to suit the needs of not just the startup itself and the business concept, but also to suit the needs of your direct team, you know? And if I were to talk personally, my favorite style of leadership, if we're talking about just leadership in its essence, is that of situational leadership. Because for me, the best leaders tend to utilize a range of different styles depending on their environment. And what I tend to say to individuals who are looking to join a startup, because on Finding Startups we also promote the recruitment of jobs on the platform, and so I always tell people considering to work for a startup or any organization for that matter to really look at the company culture. And a lot of the company culture comes from the essence of the founders' personalities and their drive and the environment that they create for the team. So every person has an environment that they thrive in. If the culture and ethics or leadership style isn't aligned with your individual energy, then perhaps you should reconsider applying, because it's just not going to work out for you. However, if you're the founder and all of that doesn't align, then you might be facing an even bigger challenge than the simple challenge of taking a business from A to Z. So in terms of from a psychological perspective, what advice would you give startup founders in their early stages when it comes to leadership and being able to adapt or even find their own? Because it's very easy to look at the different 9 styles, but how do you know, or how do you find out which is your own? Is there a test?
Yeah, there's a test, and there's a comprehensive way to do this. And then there's also the kind of newspaper horoscope way to do this. So I really don't recommend the simpler way, because this is a very profound way of disturbing and or liberating your ego. So I don't recommend people play around with it. In fact, my teacher doesn't really even believe that you should be tested. His way of teaching any type work, because as I said, it's not even psychology based, it's actually a profound tool for life to heal a lot of your suffering and to actually prepare for death. This is really how it's taught. And remember, we said it came from the words of a mystic. It was not kind of a laboratory type thing, but it got scientifically tested afterwards across cultures. The test I use is from South Africa. I find it the most comprehensive and the most truthful, because I tested on many different versions. And on the one in South Africa, I saw aspects that after 4 years of not being tested, I was developing my own insight about the Enneatype work, which is the way Claudia Naranjo suggests people discover their type through their own personal analysis. But in the case where people can't do that, which is often, I find, because it takes years of self-awareness work, I suggest this test. It's a 25-page report. It goes very deep and beyond the Enneagram even, because it talks about the blind spots, and it talks about skills that you need to learn to relate better with people, to be more influential, to have less stress, to get better at your job in your leadership role, and also for your own internal integration as a person. There's certain things that can be done. The other thing I think is good to just start off with when people are figuring it out and not sure if they're ready to get tested, because it's an investment. You need to really be wanting to become a great leader and to accept the responsibility of then investing in yourself to do that, because that's what it takes, and that's what people want to learn from you. People want to be inspired by people that have done the work. They don't just want someone who's going to tell them what to do.
Yeah.
People are way too smart for that, especially now, and they don't need somebody, quite frankly, anymore that's going to tell them what to do. They need autonomy, independence. They need to find their own way. And so if you're not going to inspire them with the real goods, there's no point anymore, even trying. So I don't think people should entertain too much of that idea. You can't just have power for the sake of power anymore. Our world is way too smart for that. So if you're not sure you want to invest yet, one thing I do think you should do is start doing some work with a professional that helps you to see some of the stuff you don't like to admit about yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's a really good way to start. And a great psychologist's forefather called Jung, many of you might know him already, Carl Gustav Jung, actually gave some great advice. The simplest thing, which works in every situation, he said, it's so important for us to do the things we don't like. It goes in contrast to what I'm saying about the genius zone. You need to do enough times the things you don't like to really see where you need to grow. And how you can grow is first in doing the things you don't like. But then you also need to know what are the things that you really like doing, and do those a lot, because then you become masterful in them. And that's your genius zone. Your growth factor, however, is this thing that Jung said, and this thing I'm talking about is your blind spots. You actually need enough attention and time in both of them, because the one is where you are so valuable to the team. The other is where you mature beyond your ego and you become a great team player and someone that people can trust, and someone that's actually challenged to do the work, so that you have then the wisdom that people are really going to learn from.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think in general, startups need to have a very inclusive culture. I mean, that's the whole purpose, really, or the whole concept of most startups, is to have, a laid back, perhaps, or at least that's the perception, is that it's a laid back, dressed down, inclusive culture. And I think it can be quite dangerous sometimes to use certain styles of leadership over others in that sort of environment. So know your team, know yourself, and take it from there, because without doing the groundwork, or exactly as you said, doing the stuff that you don't like doing, the rest will just be even harder. So I will actually bring this to a close, unless there's anything you'd like to add. But I know that the next session we have is even more interesting, if that's possible. And we're talking about stamina and entrepreneurship. And I really like that topic, which obviously we'll leave for next time. But I like it more because yesterday I was reading, I can't remember what I was reading, but it was an article and it was very interesting. It said a lot of people tend to congratulate or celebrate startups or the startup process, but very few people celebrate the keep goings. So I really like that, because actually it takes a lot more to keep going than it does to start up, because anybody can start up, but to have the stamina and the impetus to just keep it going when you just don't see the light at the end of the tunnel is what differentiates you from other people. So
absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think it's a wonderful thing that you're doing to give people a little bit more support around the time in their life where they are very uncertain of the future, and also very hopeful about the future, and really wanting to pin down something that's going to grow and support them. And in saying that, with everything we've shared today, let's just remember that we all have incredible resilience and skills that we've developed through our life. And that's why we want to talk about stamina, because we do have a key component for it already, and we need to know that, and we need to cultivate it like you would in a laboratory, you would in a kitchen, you're cooking up something, and life is like that. You're cooking up from these ingredients a really wonderful thing that's going to nourish you. And as a startup, that's, I think, what you're trying to do, is look at, what do I have to work with? And I'm suggesting today that it needs a deep look, because you have a lot of stuff that's not going to serve you, that you pretty much believe just because your ego told you that's how it's going to be, and that made you feel safe, and that's your comfort zone, so then you buy into it. And you do that for your whole life. And it's going to be pretty painful every time you bump up against something that tells you, well, that's really not how it is, or someone tells you, well, that's not what I think, or someone says that's not how we do it here, right? And those are the moments. So we know that this is true, and that deeper look helps us get in touch with that, and then it helps us peacefully adjust to the reality that, yes, okay, there's a whole bunch of other stuff I have to deal with, and I have to think about, and I have to integrate. And then there's a great thing of, I can choose certain people to help me. And that's a really important thing to have to do, because you don't have to do all the things that you don't know how to do yourself. It's quite wise to choose others. But then also, if I stick with it, I can actually become really powerful and really influential and really helpful to others because of this journey. So it's a win-win, but as we said, it needs a serious mind to know that I'm investing in myself to actually figure out more, take this deeper look into what do I need to work on still, and what do I use at the table. And the more informed I am about that, the less dangerous I am to others and the less hurt I get, quite frankly. So wonderful. Next time we talk more about that really powerful resilience we have and how to make it even stronger and how to be really real about what this road takes.
Yeah, excellent. And actually, just on a final note, something that I strongly believe in and people should be open to is, if you are the founder and CEO of your startup and along the line you find that you are not necessarily the right person for the job, that does not mean that your business is going to fail. If you have the right guidance, if you have the right attitude, perhaps you should be the one to step aside and give the position of CEO to somebody else, and see your business thrive the way you want it to thrive, and just set your ego aside, as we've said. So it's just an all-encompassing, know who you are, take your leadership from that standpoint, and really good luck because it's a tough road ahead.
Good luck to everybody, and there's loads of support around. You just have to ask for it. I'm here, Samantha's here, her network is here, my network is here, and loads of other people. So we hope this video really helped you, and we look forward to doing it again. Samantha, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for spending time with us again today, Helenique, and we'll see you at the next one.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks. Bye.